My name is Amanda Brannigan and I'm Senior Librarian here in Louth County Libraries. I welcome you all this evening, especially on such a bad night. Tonight's event is part of a greater event that we have been running here in the library for the past 3 weeks and ongoing for another 2 weeks, the Anne Frank Anew exhibition. It's a multimedia exhibition. Part of it is up here in the reference library, and you may have seen the historic part of the exhibition downstairs in the main library. It has been roughly 6 months in the planning, and we were lucky enough to secure funding through the small grants programme of Peace 3 through the County Louth's Peace and Reconciliation Partnership to fund the project. We have the exhibition on hire from the Anne Frank Trust UK for 5 weeks. It started on the 17th of September. We launched it on the 18th and we're running it until the 19th of October. We have guided tours running right throughout the week for the 5 weeks, and by the end of the exhibition we'll have welcomed over 80 groups. A mixture of primary schools, secondary schools, community organisations, active retirement groups, intellectual disability groups, groups from deaf hear organisations, all parts of the community, as well as the general public. For anyone who has yet to see the exhibition and wants to, it's open during library opening hours, which are Tuesday to Saturday, 10 to 5, and also our 2 late nights, which are Tuesday and Thursday nights until 8. A guided tour isn't essential. The guided tours are by appointment only. So I would ask, we have very few slots left, but if there is anyone that wants to avail of a guided tour, to please ring me here at the library or send me an email or call in and ask. I should also give a big thank you to our tour guides, some of whom are here tonight. All our tour guides are volunteers from the community who really have given of their time and their expertise to take part. And I think for them and for us, it's been a learning curve, and I think from the feedback they've given me, they've got a lot out of it, as much as we have as well. Feedback from the whole exhibition has been amazing. It really, I mean, as you know, Anne Frank was one of the most renowned victims of the Holocaust, and I'm not going to say too much about her because I know Yanky will speak more on the subject. But you know, she gained international fame following the publication of her diary after her death, and the exhibition has really struck a chord both with children and adults, everyone that has come. So for anyone that hasn't seen it, I'd welcome you to come back to the library. And that is basically, in terms of housekeeping, there's some seats at the back, and we also have a couple here. In terms of housekeeping, emergency escapes, not that we'll need them, but just in case, this door, there's a door down at the back of the reference library as well. I just ask anyone to switch off their mobile phones, and without further ado, I'll hand you over to Yanky. And I'd just like to give a big thank you, I should have said, to Yanky for tonight's talk. Obviously all his experience and work on the Holocaust and everything to do with it just tied in so well with our hosting of the exhibition, so we'd really like to welcome and thank him tonight.
Anne Frank died 10 months before I was born. Could you hear me at the back? Yes. Okay. Yet in some way I've always felt connected to her. 2 Jewish girls were born in the 1920s in Frankfurt, Germany. Anne Frank was born in 1929. My mother, Eva Becker, was born in 1922. In 1933, when anti-Jewish legislation, I'm talking about official laws discriminating against the Jews, got too much, Otto Frank, that's Anne's father, who incidentally, and I've just read that on the panel behind there, I did not realize that Otto Frank was a 7th generation Frankfurt Jew who had fought in the First World War for Germany and received an Iron Cross. Otto, Anne's father, decided to move his family, that's his wife and 2 daughters, from Frankfurt to the safety of Amsterdam in neutral Holland. In 1938, when anti-Jewish legislation reached a peak in Frankfurt, my grandfather decided to move his family, also wife and 2 daughters, to the safety of England. And their journey took them, that's my mother, her sister and her parents, via Amsterdam. So we have some very definite parallels here. In 1939, my father, then a 15-year-old teenager, left Berlin in Germany on the Kindertransport program. The Kindertransport program, we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. His journey to Britain took him also via Holland. And I'm only here today because both my father and my mother escaped as teenagers from Nazi Germany. Anne Frank is not here today because tragically Amsterdam did not prove to be the safe haven the Frank family was seeking. As we know, even though the Frank family went into hiding in the famous attic, probably the most famous attic in the world, they were arrested by the Gestapo after being betrayed by a local Dutch resident. Just in brackets, the Dutch had a very good press during the war and after the war. I remember growing up, my mum could not stop talking about Queen Juliana, I think it was, who was the, if I'm not mistaken, the wartime queen in exile. And my mother, her memories of Holland were only positive. The week or so that she spent in Holland en route to England, she could only talk about the food, because she could have kosher food for the first time in many, many years, because it wasn't allowed in Germany, and the freedom and the way the Dutch were so good. What many people don't realize is that Holland had per capita the highest proportion of volunteers for the SS in the whole of Europe. Something that doesn't get much publicity. So the fact that Anne Frank and her family, that they were arrested after a tip-off from a local Dutch person, is not actually as surprising as it might seem. After being kept in the Westerbork transit camp, the Frank family was sent to Auschwitz in Poland. Otto Frank survived the Holocaust. His wife died in Auschwitz, and his daughters, Margot and Anne, ended up in Bergen Belsen in Germany, where they died just a few weeks before the camp was liberated by the British Army. A couple of years ago in California, I had the privilege to meet a woman called Rose de Lima, who had been in hiding in The Hague, had been arrested at the same time as the Franks, and who met them and befriended them in Westerbork. Rose survived Auschwitz, and after the war, for many, many years, stayed in contact with Otto Frank. And she spends a lot of her time in California going around the schools telling them about the Holocaust. In that same Holocaust, that same orgy of murder that claimed the lives of 6 million Jews, my father lost his parents and almost every other member of his family. The Frank family, my mother's family, and all the others were murdered for one reason and one reason only: because they were Jews. It didn't matter that they had been useful members of society, war veterans who fought for Germany in World War I, like Otto Frank, surgeons, professors, sports champions, scientists. Their crime was that they were Jewish and they had to be exterminated. I've called my talk Anne Frank, the Irish dimension. As we all know, Ireland was neutral in the period of the Holocaust. What not everyone knows is that the Nazis planned to extend the Holocaust to Ireland. As early as January 1942, during the Wannsee Conference, where the logistics of the final solution were finalized, the Nazis knew that there were 4,000 Jews living in Ireland, and they probably knew their names and addresses. And they were all earmarked for murder once the Germans arrived. Not if the Germans arrive, but once the Germans arrived. So the first Irish connection between Anne Frank and Ireland is that the Nazis planned the same fate for all the Jews in Ireland, and we have here this evening some members of the Jewish community whose parents were living in Ireland at that time, were earmarked for the same fate as befell Anne Frank. In fact, only one Irish Jew was murdered in the Holocaust. Her name was Etty Steinberg. Etty had arrived from Czechoslovakia to Ireland in 1925 at the age of 11, and she lived off Dublin's South Circular Road, where many other Jewish families lived. She attended St. Catherine's School in Donore Avenue, and she worked for a while as a seamstress before getting married in Greenville Hall Synagogue in 1937 to Haskell Gluck, a goldsmith from Antwerp in Belgium. After the wedding, the young couple moved to Antwerp. In 1938, Etty and Haskell, like many Jews living in Belgium, who were feeling vulnerable in the face of the Nazi menace, moved for safety to France. Their son Leon was born in Paris in March 1939, and when World War II broke out a few months later, Etty and family moved south because they regarded this as a safer haven. Everything changed following the fall of France in 1940. The Vichy puppet regime maintained full sovereignty in the unoccupied southern so-called free zone of France, while the Germans occupied the northern zone. The Gluck family moved from place to place in the free zone, constantly trying to avoid being arrested. In late 1942, Etty, Haskell, and Leon were staying in a hotel in Toulouse when they were rounded up by French civilian policemen. I repeat, civilian policemen, not the Germans. All the French Jews who were arrested by French civilian police, probably after being betrayed, and transported to Auschwitz on September the 2nd, 1942. Back in Ireland, Etty's family had been desperately trying to obtain visas for Etty and her family through the British Home Office in Belfast. And miraculously, the British came up with visas that would have allowed Etty and family to travel to Northern Ireland. The Steinberg family in Dublin immediately sent these visas to Toulouse, and the visas arrived 24 hours after the three members of the Gluck family had been rounded up and sent to their deaths. At some point after her arrest, Etty somehow managed to write a final postcard to her family in Ireland. She threw it out the train window. A passerby found the postcard, posted it to the Steinberg family in Dublin. It was a bitter closure, but at least it was closure. Etty was the only Irish citizen to be murdered in the Holocaust. But several Jews who found temporary shelter in Ireland were also murdered in the Holocaust. In the years previous to World War II, Minister for Trade Sean Lemass was actively examining ways of creating new employment opportunities in Ireland. Some of you will remember those times. There was almost no employment in Ireland in the West, and Lemass's idea was to persuade European factory owners to move their factories to Ireland and set up shop here. And thanks to the intervention of an Irish Jewish businessman called Marcus Whitstone, 3 businesses, 3 factories did relocate, together creating about 1,000 jobs in Ireland. And those of you who know anything about Irish history, that was a very large number of people, especially that this was all in the West, which was really bereft of employment. One was a hat factory called Les Modes Modernes in Galway, run by Serge Philipson. Serge's wife and daughter came to Ireland for the opening of the factory, but returned to France. And when Germany overran France in 1940, Serge's wife was caught, deported, and murdered. Luckily, his daughter managed to survive by hiding throughout the war. I've been in touch with her recently over a book that I've written, which I will talk about a little later. I needed to check some facts with her about her father, and she's alive and well and living in America. A second business was the Western Hats factory in Castlebar, County Mayo. And a third factory was Emil Hirsch's ribbon factory. I had written in my script here, and his granddaughter Jenny lives not too far from here. I can now add his granddaughter Jenny is sitting about 8 feet in front of me. Among the people due to come over from Europe to work in Jenny's grandfather's ribbon factory were the Clare family, or the Clare family. Some of you might recognize the name Clare. There was a book called Last Waltz in Vienna that some of you may have read by George Clare, formerly Clare. At the time, the passport and visa section of the Irish legation in Berlin was headed by a notorious pro-Nazi anti-Semite by the name of Charles Bewley. Yes, from the Bewley family, but not a Quaker like all the other Bewleys. He lied to the Clares, telling them he had received no instructions about their visas, even though he had their visas in his desk. By the time the visas came through, Clare Sr., George's father, had found another job in France. So instead of waiting for his visa that would allow him to get to Ireland to go and work in the ribbon factory, he took up a job in a bank. He was a banker in France. Like Serge Philipson's wife, Mr. and Mrs. Clare were in France when the country was overrun by the Nazis. The Clares were arrested by French civilian police and sent to their deaths. Actually, I only found out recently, they only arrested Ernst Clare, that's George's father. And his wife said, I'm going with. And even though she wasn't arrested, she joined him and died with him. We know that Anne Frank, now aged 16, spent the last few months of her life in the Bergen Belsen concentration camp. In the very next barracks, those of you that know roughly what Auschwitz looks like, there were barracks, long barracks. And in the very next barracks Bergen Belsen. And in the very next barracks, next to Anne Frank, was a 7-year-old boy by the name of Tommy Reichenthal. Some of you will have seen Tommy's film. He's been to Dundalk and spoke to schools. He spoke recently. There was a film of him shown a few days ago. And Tommy's family had lived in Slovakia for several generations, just like Otto Frank had lived for countless generations in Frankfurt. But this did not help the family when a Roman Catholic priest, Monsignor Tiso, became the head of the new independent Slovakian government. Slovakia decided to get rid of all her Jewish subjects. Actually, Slovakia was also the only country in Europe that managed to make a profit on its Jews, because they had an arrangement with Nazi Germany that they would receive money for every Jew they sent to their deaths in the death camps. A very lucrative business. Just as a neighbor betrayed Anne Frank's family, so a neighbor betrayed Tommy's father. He was arrested and put on a train to Auschwitz. He had the good luck of being next to a safe cracker. And the safe cracker had secreted his safe cracking tools. And the safe cracker, this astonishing story, cut a hole in the floor of the train taking these Jews to Auschwitz. And he said, "I'm jumping out. Anyone want to come with me?" And Tommy's father said, "Yep." And they jumped through the hole. They did not get run over, obviously. They managed to jump through and out, and Tommy's father escaped what would have been absolute, definite death. It wasn't until after the war that Tommy discovered that his father hadn't died. They knew he'd gone off to Auschwitz. By then, people knew Auschwitz meant death. Tommy, his mother, and his brother and other family members were arrested later and were due to be deported to Auschwitz. Being deported to Auschwitz meant absolute guarantee death. But that very day that their train was meant to go to Auschwitz, the Jews who were forced to work in the crematoria in Auschwitz managed to blow up one of the crematoria. So all of a sudden, the death machine in Auschwitz was working at half-cock. It couldn't receive all the Jews that were being sent there. And so Tommy and his mother and his sister and his brother, their train got diverted, and instead of going to Auschwitz, it was sent to Bergen Belsen. Now, of course, Tommy didn't know that literally in the next barracks, Anne Frank was there. Unlike Anne Frank, Tommy survived. He lost 30 members of his family in the Holocaust. He, his brother, and his parents made their way to Israel. Tommy served in the Israeli army, and he won a scholarship to study engineering in Germany. He arrived in Dublin to help set up a factory, and in Dublin he fell in love with a Jewish girl called Ivan. They raised their family here, and they had 3 boys. Ivan died in 2002. And in the over 40 years they were married, Tommy never told her or the children anything about the horrendous childhood experiences he'd had in Bergen Belsen. Nothing. Stumm. And it wasn't until the first Holocaust Memorial Day in Dublin, that I was privileged to be the chair of in January 2003 and have chaired every year since, that Tommy first revealed his past. And since then, he has addressed over 50,000 students throughout Ireland, and now because of his films, I attended the premiere of his film at a film festival in Ashkelon in Israel a few months ago, and Tommy is now becoming quite internationally known because he was so young in the Holocaust that he's still young enough, if you will, to be able to have the energy to speak to almost every week. He is speaking somewhere in the world to audiences about the Holocaust. His story has been featured in To the 10th Generation in an RTE TV documentary that's been shown around the world, and a follow-up documentary, Close to Evil, was shown earlier this week, I believe, in the IFI. Tommy has written a best-selling book on his Holocaust experiences, I Was a Boy in Belsen, and last month Tommy and I appeared together on TV3's The Morning Show talking about Nazi war criminals. Tommy was not the only child incarcerated in Bergen Belsen at the same time as Anne Frank. In another barracks, of which Tommy had no knowledge, was another 6-year-old child called Terry. Terry, his little sister Susie and their mother were among the last of Hungary's Jews to be deported. In Bergen Belsen, Terry's mother had tuberculosis and Susie had typhus. 6-year-old Terry looked after both of them. Shortly after Bergen Belsen was liberated in April 1945, Terry's mother succumbed and died. We will return to Terry and Susie in a moment. As we've mentioned, Anne Frank died a few weeks before the liberation. One of the first British officers to arrive at Bergen Belsen after its liberation was a gentleman called Captain Chaim Herzog. He was born in Belfast, the oldest son of Rabbi Dr. Isaac Herzog. Chaim moved to Dublin when his father became the first chief rabbi of the Irish Free State. Actually, he became the chief rabbi before the Irish Free State was formed. It was one of those ideas that the provisional government had of staking their independence even before it became official, and so they declared him the Irish chief rabbi. Chaim, the son, studied in Israel, then known as Palestine. That's after having been brought up right through his childhood in Dublin. He interrupted his law studies in Cambridge to join the Sandhurst Military Academy. He served as an intelligence officer in the British Army, and he participated in the D-Day landings. Chaim later described the scene that awaited him when he first arrived at the gates of Bergen Belsen. I drove to Bergen Belsen, having heard whispers of the atrocities that had occurred there. The entire scene was made more apocalyptic, if that's even possible, by the fact that because typhus raged throughout the camp, the wooden barracks were being burnt to the ground. I told some of the survivors I was a Jewish officer from Palestine. They all burst into tears. Chaim Herzog went on to become president of the State of Israel, and during his state visit to Ireland in 1985, he astonished audiences by prefacing his remarks in fluent Irish. Her Majesty the Queen managed a sentence or two, and that got headlines all over the country. Chaim was a fluent Irish speaker, as was his rabbi father, who also astonished audiences by remembering his Irish for many, many years. Immediately after the liberation, Bergen Belsen was turned into a DP, displaced persons camp for the Jews. Jewish survivors of the forced labor camps, concentration camps, extermination camps, and death marches were all herded together in Bergen Belsen. Bertha Winegreen from Dublin, who was the head of the Jewish Scouts movement in Dublin, was appointed Chief Welfare Officer responsible for all Jewish displaced persons in the British zone of occupation, and she was stationed in the Bergen Belsen camp. Bergen Belsen also contained thousands of Polish Jews who fled to Germany after so many Polish Jews returning to their homes in Poland were murdered by the Poles after the Holocaust. Two of my father's uncles survived the camps, alive, went into DP camps, came out, and in July 1946, they and 48 other Jews were burnt alive by their Polish neighbors because they had the nerve to go back to their hometown to try and restart their lives again in the town of Kielce. Bertha Weingreen was appointed officer commanding Belsen and given the rank of lieutenant. A few months later, another lieutenant arrived in Bergen Belsen. He'd been appointed Director of Education for all Jewish DPs. He started a school. His name was Professor Jacob Jack Weingreen. He was Bertha's husband. He was a Trinity College professor. His book on Hebrew grammar is still, today, regarded as the best biblical Hebrew grammar ever written, and is still studied and is still in print. And for several months, Bertha was Jack's boss, and throughout the camp, Jack was known as Herr Bertha. Jack had taken leave of absence from Trinity to volunteer in helping the Jewish displaced persons. In Dublin, a number of young Jews formed a relief organization, and they sent toys and clothes to the Weingreens and even persuaded linen mills in Northern Ireland to donate material for nappies to cater for the baby boom in the camp. Suddenly, this place where thousands and thousands had died, babies were being born. Jack later described what happened when the gifts arrived. There was immense joy and excitement when the children were given brand new clothes, an experience with many of them had for the first time in their young lives. And in Bergen Belsen, Jack established a flourishing trade school. Another volunteer in Bergen Belsen, we're all the time talking about the Bergen Belsen camp, where Anne Frank had died just weeks before liberation, and we're now talking about the weeks and months after liberation, where this same camp it wasn't a death camp, and yet it was, by which I mean a death camp is a camp established to kill. So we know that Treblinka and Auschwitz were industrialized death factories. Bergen Belsen wasn't. It was a place where Jews were herded and kept. But the conditions were such that tens of thousands died there. And the awful thing is that after liberation, for the first few days, 1,000 Jews a day died. After liberation. Because they were, at the end, they were sick. And when they did try and ingest food, proper food, that was their end as well. It was a terrible, terrible experience. So another volunteer was Dr. Bob Collis, a non-Jewish Irish physician who volunteered for the British Red Cross. Arriving in the camp shortly after liberation, he saw immediately there was a desperate need for his experience. Accompanying him was a Dutch nurse and interpreter, Han Hogetzijl, whom he later married. They described their first experience in Belsen. One man whose blue-striped pajamas, we all know about the blue-striped pajamas, hung from him like a cloak, whose head was shaved and face mud-colored, ran or half ran towards the leading tank, crying as he ran. A few paces off, he sank upon his knees and died. As Chaim Herzog had written, the malnutrition of the inmates was accentuated by an epidemic of typhus. Even after the liberation, as I just said, survivors were dying. Dr. Collis evacuated all the sick from the overcrowded barracks and then took charge of a makeshift children's hospital, which he and Han ran for several months. One by one, all the children under Dr. Collis's care in the hospital were found homes. 5 Hungarian orphan children, for whom no home or family could be found, were left. We've already met 2 of the 5 children, Terry and Susie from Hungary. There was also a little boy called Zoltan, his sister Edith, and a girl called Evelyn. Dr. Collis made the radical decision to bring these 5 orphans back with him to Ireland. And after they spent some months in Malmö, Sweden, for a period of convalescence, Dr. Collis arrived with the children at Dublin Airport in late 1946. I don't know how he did it, but he somehow managed to persuade the immigration authorities to waive procedures, since, of course, none of the children had any documentation. I imagine he just outstared the officials in Dublin Airport and sort of said, "What you going to do, eh?" An amazing gesture. Dr. Collis sent the children for further convalescence at Fairy Hill in Howth, a facility that he had helped establish for the recuperation of Dublin tenement children with TB. Dr. Collis managed to find a Jewish couple, Willie and Elsie Samuels, and they adopted Terry and Susie. He found another family for Evelyn, who later moved to Australia. Dr. Collis had had a soft spot for Zoltan ever since he had first lifted up the little black-haired child in Belsen. Zoltan had declared in German, "My father is dead, you are now my father." So Dr. Collis adopted Zoltan and Edith himself. Terry, Susie, Zoltan and Edith all grew up and remained in Ireland. Of the 4, only Susie is still alive. We mentioned Auschwitz, where Anne Frank had been held before being transferred to Bergen Belsen. One of the most notorious monsters associated with this notorious death camp was Dr. Joseph Mengele, the angel of death, who conducted horrific experiments on inmates. Helen Lewis, a 5-foot-tall dancer from Czechoslovakia, avoided becoming one of the 1.5 million Jews murdered in Auschwitz when she stepped out of the women's line heading for Mengele's table. She joined a line going in the other direction to collect their clothes. Helen cheated death again in the winter of 1944 when she was in the Stutthof slave labor camp near Danzig on the Baltic Sea. She was close to dying from the extreme cold, disease and hunger when the commandant of the women's camp suddenly learnt of Helen's pre-war career as a dancer. So instead of taking part in the heavy manual labor in the Polish winter that would definitely have killed her, Helen performed in the show, and the extra rations that she received helped in her survival. The 3rd time Helen cheated death was when she somehow survived the death march from Stutthof towards the end of the war. In her memoir, A Time to Speak, Helen describes what happened. "We were marched out of the camp in rows of 5, leaving behind those who were not capable of walking. We knew from past experience what their fate would be and dared not talk or even think of them. We were escorted by the fiercest and most dreaded SS guards who shouted, 'Schneller, schneller, quicker, quicker, faster, faster.' Helen survived, but over half of the death marchers perished. Helen lost all her family, including her husband Paul. After the war, Helen's childhood friend Harry Lewis, who had fled to Belfast before the war, spotted her name on a Red Cross list of survivors. He came looking for her. They married, and Helen became known as Northern Ireland's First Lady of Dance. In later life, Helen, Mona and I were privileged to meet Helen before she died. She was asked how she survived the Holocaust, while others like Anne Frank did not. And Helen said, "There is no logical reason that I can give why I survived the Holocaust. It has got nothing to do with any qualities, physical or otherwise, that I possessed. Millions who were stronger, wiser, better equipped, more courageous than I ever was, have not survived. We were all destined for the gas chambers. Whenever I go over the events of those years in my mind, I can make little sense of it." I mentioned earlier that my father got out of Germany thanks to a rescue operation called Kindertransport. To understand the background of this rescue operation, let us follow the story of Geoffrey Phillips. 10th of November 1938 was the morning after Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, an orgy of violence that saw over 100 Jews murdered, 1,000 synagogues burnt to the ground, and 30,000 Jews imprisoned. 13-year-old Geoffrey and his family lived in Germany and learned from neighbors that their synagogue had been burnt to the ground during the night. As the members of the household, Geoffrey, his parents, a bachelor uncle and a spinster aunt, were trying to absorb the enormity of the catastrophe, there was a loud knock on the door. 2 plainclothes Nazi policemen ordered Geoffrey's father to pack an overnight bag and to accompany them. They led him away, and this was the last time Geoffrey ever saw his father. He later learned that his father was one of the first victims of the Holocaust. Many historians now date the beginning of the Holocaust to that Kristallnacht. Although Kristallnacht was widely reported throughout the world, Britain was the only country that took immediate action. 2 nights ago I was in Cavan talking to an interfaith group, North and South Catholic Protestant. And in the Q&A I was asked, why was Britain the only country to extend any sort of help to the Jews prior to World War II, when the depth of Nazi depravity was already known? And of course I have no answer. In London, a deputation of Jewish leaders, together with some Quaker and Christian leaders, lobbied the British government to allow unaccompanied Jewish child refugees to seek refuge in Britain. The British cabinet approved the rescue operation that we now know as Kindertransport, the transport of children. Geoffrey was very lucky. His aunt was a welfare officer in a neighbouring Jewish community. She heard about the Kindertransport program and urged Geoffrey's mother to register him. Geoffrey was accepted. All he was allowed to take with him was the regulation small suitcase and another small bag with provisions. And on December the 15th, 1938, less than 6 weeks after Kristallnacht, Geoffrey boarded a special train together with other children. And as he waved farewell to his mother, he had no idea that he would never see her again. His mother, bravely waving goodbye on the platform, must surely have suspected that this was the last time she would see Geoffrey. A few months later, in May 1939, the identical scene took place in Berlin's railway station when my father waved goodbye to his parents and never saw them again. My father ended up in a farm school in Scotland and later joined the British Army. Geoffrey ended up in a hostel for boys in Leeds, and he later joined the British Army. After the war, Geoffrey went to work in a weaving mill in Bradford, and in 1950 he was sent to supervise the construction of a new mill in Sallynoggin, Dunleary, and moved to Ireland with his young family. Geoffrey only died a couple of years ago. Lovely man who did his, I think he did his BA at the age of 80. We went to the party after he got his BA. So we saw how Geoffrey's father was taken away on the day after the Kristallnacht pogrom. Another German Jew arrested the same day was Ernst Scheier, who was born in 1890. Like Geoffrey's father, Ernst volunteered for service in the German Imperial Army during World War I, and like Otto Frank. You have to remember, all these proud German Jews had proudly fought for Germany in World War I. 100,000 Jews fought for Germany in World War I, often fighting against their cousins who were fighting for the French or the British. Weird. Ernst became a successful lawyer and notary. When the Nazis rose to power in 1933, Ernst was prevented from being a notary. And on Kristallnacht, he was among 26,000 Jews who were arrested. He was incarcerated in Sachsenhausen concentration camp, a once proud war veteran and respected pillar of society, reduced to being prisoner number 012798. Ernst was lucky on two counts. One, the Nazi authorities released him with orders to leave the country. Two, he was able to come to Ireland. Now, the way I say it, you'd think, hey, the Nazis said, you've got to leave. Brilliant. So why didn't the other 150,000 German Jews leave? Well, we know the answer, don't we? No one would take them in. How did Ernst Scheier get to Ireland? Well, very lucky. His son Heinz was already in Ireland, having won a scholarship to Trinity College to study medicine. And thanks to a guarantee from a Jewish ophthalmologist in Dublin, Heinz obtained a 1-month visa for his parents to visit the United Kingdom and Ireland. In January 1939, Ernst and his wife arrived in Dublin. At the age of 49, he could not work as a lawyer since the legal codes of the two countries were so different. So he taught German privately during the war. And from 1947 to 1958, he was an assistant in German at Trinity College, where he taught literature and German to science students. One of the very, very few Jews who reached the safety of Ireland. We saw how the Kristallnacht pogrom helped create the Kindertransport program. The rescued children stayed in private homes, in hostels, in farm schools and other places. Over 150 of these Kindertransport children came to Northern Ireland during the war. In May 1939, Barney Hurwitz, president of the Belfast Hebrew congregation, sat over a drink in Mooney's bar in Belfast's Cornmarket and signed a lease with Lawrence Gorman, the owner of a 70-acre derelict farm on the County Down coast. Hurwitz turned Mill Isle Farm into a refugee resettlement centre for Kindertransport children. the small Belfast community took Mill Isle Farm under their wing and established a refugee aid committee. Funds were raised by the Belfast and Dublin Jewish communities, as well as from the Central British Fund, the joint churches of Northern Ireland, and later from the Northern Ireland Ministry of Agriculture. Every summer during the war years, young Jewish volunteers came from Belfast and Dublin to help out at the farm, and I've met some of these people, not so young anymore, who still have wonderful memories of travelling up from Dublin. We're talking about during the emergency, into Northern Ireland, spending weeks helping to look after these orphaned children. Several months after the end of the war, in February 1946, a transport plane brought 100 children to Nuts Corner Airport outside Belfast. The children were all survivors of concentration camps, and they joined the children already in Mill Isle. 50 years after Mill Isle closed, Dublin-based librarian and children's author Marilyn Taylor realized that only an accident of geography had spared her and her sister from being among the 1.5 million Jewish children murdered by the Nazis. Marilyn, the wife of Labour TD and Minister Mervyn Taylor, the first ever Jewish cabinet minister in Ireland, decided to engage young readers in themes that were now becoming relevant in multicultural Ireland: refugees, prejudice, racism and diversity, by writing a novel. And the theme she chose in Far Away Home, a best-selling novel for teenagers and adults, was the true story of the Mill Isle refugee farm. Without Marilyn's book, I think there is a danger that the Mill Isle story may have dropped out of the consciousness of the Irish Jewish community. The book was a runaway bestseller, and in 2004, Marilyn won the Bistow Book of the Year award, Ireland's most prestigious children's literary prize. Incidentally, I share with Marilyn the distinction of having been born in the same maternity unit in Hitchin, Hertfordshire. Anne Frank has become one of the most famous, iconic symbols of the Holocaust. I fear that somewhere along the way, she's become such a romantic symbol that many people forget why she fled her native Germany, why she had to hide in the attic, why she wrote her diary, why she was arrested, why she found herself in Auschwitz, and why she met her death in Bergen Belsen. These things happened to her for one simple reason: she was Jewish and therefore unfit to live. She was Jewish and therefore sentenced to be murdered. Like all the other 6 million victims of the Holocaust, she had committed no other crime than being Jewish. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't a civilian killed by collateral damage as part of the hostilities. She was earmarked to death not because she did anything, but because of who she was. She was a Jew and she had to die. If, God forbid, the Nazis had invaded Ireland, and recently discovered documents show that there were detailed plans for an invasion, the 4,000 Jews of Ireland would have been arrested and sent to their deaths. This is not speculation. In this talk, I've described some Irish connections with Anne Frank, with Bergen Belsen, with the Holocaust, with Kristallnacht, and with the Kindertransport. As part of the gathering this year, Ireland's Jewish community held its own Jewish gathering in July. And to coincide with a week-long program of events, I wrote a book called Kaleidoscope, 100 characters who shaped the Irish Jewish community. All the people I have mentioned this evening: Etty Steinberg, Terry and Susie Samuels, Dr. Collis, Professor Jack Winegreen, Bertha Winegreen, Helen Lewis, Jeffrey Phillips, Chaim Herzog, Ernst Shire and Marilyn Taylor, all feature in the book, and it was very gratifying to have President Michael D. Higgins quote from the book when he addressed the audience at a Family House concert during the Jewish gathering. I've already mentioned my own personal connections. My father, who now lives in Jerusalem, who I saw 4 days ago in Jerusalem, still vividly remembers looking out his bedroom window, watching Nazi thugs smashing up the synagogue where he had had his bar mitzvah just 2 years earlier. On Kristallnacht, I'm talking about, he watched the synagogue being smashed up on Kristallnacht, November 1938. 3 years ago, my father and I traveled to Berlin to visit his former home. We looked out of the same window as he had looked out at the now reconstructed synagogue. And when he told me about his story and my mother's story and how these teenagers escaped, this is a book that I've spoken about several times in Dundalk and around the world. When I read what he said about looking out of his window at his synagogue being smashed, I don't know, I had something like looking out his window and seeing Mullins at the other side of the road. But when I stood with him, looking out of that window, I could almost touch the roof of that synagogue. Why was the synagogue not burnt to the ground like so many hundreds others? Because there were some non-Jewish families living in the same courtyard, and God forbid we didn't want to disturb them. While we were there, 2010, we were introduced to a young boy who had just celebrated his bar mitzvah, the first bar mitzvah since Kristallnacht. Next month, on the 75th anniversary of Kristallnacht, my father will be guest of honor at the rededication of this synagogue in Berlin. Accompanying him will be his sister, who also escaped on the Kindertransport, 5 of his children, including me, his nephews and friends. It will be a very moving event. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure it would please Anne Frank to know how much she is remembered nearly 70 years after the end of the Holocaust. I'm also sure that it would please her to know that my mother, Eva, the other Frankfurt girl who escaped from Frankfurt via Holland to England, survived the Holocaust and got her revenge on the Nazis by becoming the matriarch to a family of 7 children, 26 grandchildren, and over 80 great-grandchildren. Thank you very much.